Hello, everybody. Uh, Welcome to my new channel, and you may notice that I have a new look, not dressed like I'm in the witness protection program. So that's good. I can be a little bit more free to be me and let my freak flag fly, as they used to say. So, I will pick off where I left off. If you want to see the earlier videos, let me know. We'll figure something out. So I am approaching age 12. Some important things are happening. One is that the incident with my mother and stepfather where they surrounded my bed when I was naked in bed and started yelling at me, kicking the bed and not accepting anything I said as an acceptable answer, really changed the nature of my relationship with them, unfortunately. Previously, like I had seen a film in school about a rebellious teenager who had issues with his parents, and I said, well, that's not me. I get along well with my parents. Well, that wasn't really true anymore. There was some kind of bond that had been broken, it seemed to me. Another thing that was happening was I was having lots of erotic fantasies, and some of them were quite, frankly, rather violent, like 1984 level back up. Marquis de Sade level of sadistic. And I think there's a couple reasons that this came up. One is that I'd found a stack of pretty hardcore bondage magazines and looked at them. Another was, just the rush of the massive amount of testosterone I was getting. And the third was I was angry. I was angry at my family. I was angry at other people at school and the kids and the adults. I was just angry at everyone. Not too atypical for a teenager, but I wasn't a teenager yet, but I was getting there. What's the third thing? Oh, yes, I was studying on my own. As an autistic person, I have special interests, and at that point, it was studying evolution, which I did on my own mostly, and I learned more about it than about what descended from what and what evolved into what than really most people I've met seem to know. And nevertheless, the school nurse told my parents that she thought I might be brain damaged. This got back to me, and I included it in a speech that I gave in class, referring to myself in the third person, but of course the teachers got it. And to be fair, it's possible that I am, because twice exceptional, exceptionally smart in some areas, exceptionally the opposite of smart in others. So yeah, anything else? Anyways, my stepfather was a doctor. He'd spent a lot of time applying for jobs in exotic locations to live so we could move there for a while. One of them was Iran. One of them was Afghanistan. Yeah. This was about 1975, and it's probably just as well that neither of those two things worked out. So then he found something that did work out. I mentioned the adults, his old friends. I called Jeffrey and Irene. I mentioned those on my other channel, so don't worry if you don't remember it. And by the way, apparently they were my godparents. I didn't realize that, but at age 9, I talked to Irene, and she later said I was full of stories, which some things never change. Obviously, I'm still full of stories. Although what stories I had at age 9, I don't know. Anyway, they were my godparents. The bottom line is their family and my family were quite close. Yeah. And so he was a doctor, and he got my stepfather, helped him get a job there as a doctor. It turned out that there was a whole like clan of people who were there on the island of Oahu, either as a direct or as an as an indirect result of this guy, Jeffrey. And so, yeah, there was a whole bunch of them that he had led to bringing over, family, friends of family, and so forth. And these were basically my parents' main circle of friends there, and to a certain extent mine as well. Yeah. And I know what I was going to say. I had already started internalizing this view of myself as not only as a rebel against my family and pretty much everybody else, but also as the weird kid in school. Unfortunately, I think I experienced that. I internalized that too much, and I played it out. I played it up really, and then I complained that kids picked on me, and also kids didn't pick on me as much as I had convinced myself they did. And it's only really recently I've realized that. But as it goes, I started school. We moved to Kaneohe, Hawaii. I started school there. There was some culture shock. The locals there speak what they call pidgin, but which is actually a Creole or a decreolized Creole, as my linguistics teacher later said. And I'm going to try not to try to speak in it because I don't remember how to do it well, and I don't want to be, accused of mocking their culture or some such. But yeah, so I moved there, and there were some incidents. I didn't actually get beat up or hit or anything, but there was like threats of it. Like this one guy, he came up to me and he said, hey, somebody said you called me an sucher. And he was like really mad about it, and he was confronting me, and I was like, I didn't even say that, which I didn't. And then an authority figure was approaching, and he said, hey, could you tell them we were just playing? I don't want to get in trouble. And I didn't, which was right, the right response. I told my mom later, and I said, did I do the right thing, or should I have gone ahead and said that we were playing? And she said, well, maybe you should have, because Gandhi, nonviolence, yada, yada. That was not a good answer, really. Gandhian tactics against bullies, and those weren't really even Gandhian tactics. I mean, come on, he reported who was doing what he felt to be wrong things. It was a crude misunderstanding of Gandhian tactics, which I held in my mind for way too long. So, yes. So also at this time, I started my spiritual quest, which has been very complicated and has continued basically my life most of the time since then, or quite a lot of the time since then. I've been actively doing that, but I really dove into it head first in Hawaii, because when I do things, I tend to do them a lot. And so, why did I do this? So my bar mitzvah was coming up. I was 12 now. Oh, and I had started smoking marijuana back in at the going away party back in Sausalito. My parents had given me permission, and I got a hold of a joint and went down with another teenager, an older teenager, and my friend Keller Autumn, who did not partake and probably wasn't very comfortable in that situation. But me and the older guy did partake, so I got high for the first time. And then I went upstairs and began drinking rum punch, rather, a fair bit of it. And so people who say that people would drink less if there was more marijuana available, in most cases, in the majority of cases, I do not think that's true. So that happened. Okay, back to Kaneohe, Hawaii. So I was preparing for my bar mitzvah. So my father flew in, and he lived in the Tenrikyo Center in Honolulu. Tenrikyo was a Japanese religion he had converted to, which once again was a blend of Buddhism, Shinto, and Abrahamic principles, meaning basically stuff they had picked up from Christianity that the Abrahamic religions believe in. So he was now not only a member of this religion, but living right in their headquarters. And so I went to visit him regularly, and he came to visit me regularly, but I went to the Tenrikyo services. My mother and stepfather were still dabbling in Tibetan Buddhism, among other things. And I was assigned to read a bunch of thick books on Jewish history and Jewish short stories and that sort of thing. And I did. By the way, this is when I really started reading grown-up books. So in California, my main hobbies had been television, which I calculated I watched about 7 hours on a weekday a day, probably more on the weekend, and comic books, which I had lots of them. Now in Hawaii, I had none of my comic books with me, and the TV reception was poor, which was actually probably a good thing. My mom was taking a class in world literature class, and I read all the books from Vonnegut to Camus that she had been assigned. After she read them, I read them. I was reading that. I was reading all these books on Jewish history and so forth. And my brother had, again, Catholic babysitters, I believe, Filipino this time, rather than Irish. But so I was getting that influence too. So I took up this very eclectic pursuit. And then I met a girl in junior high, which covered, over there, it covered 7th to 9th grade. So I was 12, she was 14. And she was a member of a group called the Children of God, which has since become famous. It became known as the sex cult, the kiddie porn cult, all sorts of awful things. I did not know about that. Although, had I been more astute at the time, I might have seen the warning signs, but I saw them only in retrospect. She invited me to one of their parties, and they were marketing themselves basically as the cool new, not like your parents' brand of Christianity, even though a lot of what they said was standard evangelical talking points. Some of it was not. The politics seemed to lean left, and well, for example, I went to a party on Saturday night. And they had some dancing with strobe lights, which I'd never seen before. And they had some skits that had dirty words in them, and crude humor. So I like that. And at the end, so there's a verse in the Bible called, there's a verse in the Bible that says that that believers should greet each other with a holy kiss. Now, they believe that, at least on this evening, they seem to believe that a holy kiss, greeting each other with a holy kiss, meant that opposite sex couples, I mean, not really couples, just anyone who happened to be close to each other, would kiss each other on the lips. And this was the first time I had ever kissed anybody on the lips. And I kissed, I don't remember the exact number. I had put it in my memory that it was every single girl and woman at the event. But that wasn't true, I realized, because there were a couple I knew that I didn't kiss. But I definitely kissed a lot of them. And yeah, so when I do things, I tend to do them a lot. And, most people's first kiss is not like that, but at 12, that was basically kind of like an orgy to me. So that was definitely an appeal. And that was by design, I later learned. The woman in my junior high school, not woman, a 14-year-old girl, 14-year-old girl, older to me, had drawn me in using a tactic which I later realized was called flirty fishing. At the time, flirty fishing literally meant flirting with somebody in order to draw them into the group. And when I did eventually join for a short time, I was encouraged to do it too. Men and women did it. Later, the term became far more sinister, but we're not there yet. All right, I might as well go there yet. Eventually, flirty fishing came to encompass having sex to attract new members, and then straight up prostitution and so forth. But that was all, at least at the level I was at, none of that was going on, and I didn't know about it, and I only learned about it much later when I was no longer affiliated with this group and had not been for, decades. But my parents didn't like it. They didn't like it at all, and I don't think we were quite on the same page. They didn't like it because it was Christian first and foremost. And then they did pick up that there was something odd about them attracting, targeting young kids, really quite young, which was, again, by design. And I was also going to Catholic church sometimes, and I started meeting with a Mormon missionary once a week and learned about that. Oh yes, and I started hanging out with the Hare Krishnas again. I'd met them, I'd encountered them as a small child, and I encountered them again, and I also started doing that. So I was attending like 7 different religions at once. And yes, going to Jewish events as well with my parents. So yeah, my brain was getting very stimulated with a lot of new ideas all at once. And the Children of God had some pamphlets which they gave me, one of which I think it was called Nittler, which referred to they called Nixon a nitwit Hitler. So cool, they're like leftists, so they're not traditional evangelical right-wing Christians, which I did later meet, and there were definitely differences and there were definitely similarities. So, my mother, oh yes, well, they gave me another pamphlet. Most of these were written by their leader, who went by the name of Moses David, and considered himself a prophet. Now, I knew that Judaism had prophets. Christianity, I guess, had what you could call prophets. Tenrikyo, my father's religion, was founded by somebody who considered himself a prophet, and so were the Mormons. And so there were prophets all over the place. It didn't seem that odd that this guy would also be a prophet. Apparently, there were a lot of them, had been in the past, and continued to be. So I got a pamphlet called what was it called? No, I forget what it was called. But basically it said, if you want God to talk to you directly, to you, what you have to do is make yourself empty, and then God's voice will come into you. And he compared it to breastfeeding, which may have had something to do more with him than anything else, but I didn't know that. And anyways, God's voice did come to me, so I thought. And wouldn't you know it, I was told that I was also a prophet. And my life's work was to basically construct a religion in which every religion, in this case, every religion that I knew about, would be simultaneously true. That was how I was trying to build a giant superstructure, a project I never fully gave up until I was 15, though I certainly put it on hold. And so I went to one of their parties and I told Elisha, who was the girl I'd met in middle school, I said, God talked to me just like I'm talking to you. And she said, well, what did you expect? Did you expect him to talk to you in some kind of weird way? And I was like, oh, apparently this is like totally normal, not strange at all. Cool. I had actually had a spiritual experience before that. One of the most intense I've ever had, actually. Possibly the most intense I've ever had. So what happened was I had been reading this book of Jewish short stories, and one of them was about a Kabbalist, a practitioner of Kabbalah, and he was he was trying to hear the voice. Basically, he was trying to hear music, which was the music of angels. And it comes from your bones. It was like God's music, and it comes right from your bones. So I got chewed out by my parents because I guess I was mistreating my younger brother. And I used to tell my younger brother that I used to pick on him a lot, but mostly that was for humorous effect. I really didn't pick on him that much. A little. Being an older brother and also having a bit of, I would now call abuse myself. It happened, but it didn't happen that much. And I clearly was, not a sociopath because I really felt guilty. The idea that I was being mean to my brother And I don't even remember what I did. Probably I was just being irritable with him and saying, shut up, don't bother me, which my parents did to him also. He went through a phase of talking a lot. Anyways, I went to my room and was utterly racked with guilt and started crying, like sobbing, seriously crying. And my stepfather came in and he saw that I was in this state and he gave me Valium. I don't know how much. He gave me some Valium. And after a while, as I was continuing to cry and what have you, and then I started to feel good. Of course, later my mom said, "Oh yeah, that was the Valium." Perhaps. I experienced the music. I experienced the music that was coming out of my bones. That was the music of angels, the music of God, the music that had been. By the way, in the story, the guy did hear the music coming from his bones and he died right after. So, he couldn't handle it. It killed him. But I was younger, so I survived the experience. I was very impressionable and very prone to having whatever mystical experiences other people told me about. I tried meditating again. I did it at school, drawing a crowd around me, which was partly spiritual grandiosity, partly me acting out the role of the weird kid. And my mom said, it's not a good idea. You'll just pick up the hostility that's around you. And that was pretty good advice, actually. And then I went to a Children of God's meeting, another one, and I learned about, like, I had taken their prayer, which I had said their prayer, which was supposed to mean that I had turned my life over to Jesus, and just as a result of having said it, I was saved. I would never go to hell. I would go to heaven. What rank I occupied in heaven was a different story, but basically I was pretty good just for having, and apparently they did this with people who didn't even speak English, didn't really know what they were saying. They market it as a song, make a song out of it, and get people in China to sing it and consider them saved. But then they had this other thing going, which was that they were speaking in tongues. This is called glossolalia, and I've only once heard it done outside of the Children of God. That was recently when I dropped into a evangelical and apparently Pentecostal church. So Pentecostalists are the fundamentalists that believe in that sort of thing. And then there's also fundamentalist Christians who believe that there's no revelation after the Bible was completed. That's the end. No more speaking in tongues, no more getting messages directly from God, speaking with tongues of men and angels, or tossing snakes around to test your faith. None of that. But the Children of God were apparently Pentecostal types. Anyways, I had a conflict at home because my mom said, well, your bar mitzvah is approaching, but if you want to do it, if you want us to do it for you, you have to identify as Jewish. And I think we were we were not communicating well, because I understood Jewish only in the religious sense at that time. I didn't really have the concept of cultural Judaism. And I knew that, my mother and stepfather were doing this other stuff. They were doing Tibetan Buddhism. And that was the other thing. They took me to this Tendai Buddhism, which is I think, Pure Land school of Japanese Buddhism, to a fire ceremony. And they were burning sticks and chanting. And I love that. That was powerful to me. But so they were doing like two kinds of Buddhism at once, and they went to see a kahuna. They were spiritual dilettantes. I guess that's where I got it from. So it seemed hypocritical. Wait a minute, you're asking me to, and I thought that if I identified as Jewish, it would mean that I could not convert to another religion in the future. I had pigeonholed myself. And my mom said, you can practice it any half-assed way that you want. She literally said it that way, in those words. Any half-assed way that you want. Now, I had read a story from one of the books that she had given me as a signed reading, in which, like, an Orthodox Jew argued, like an ultra-Orthodox Jew argued with a more Reform group Jew, I guess. And he said, what the parents do halfway, the children will not do at all. Meaning, if you practice a half-assed form of Judaism, your child will basically not practice it at all. And so I told my mom that, and she did not like that I was using one of the books she had told me to read, that I was using material from it against her. Later, she told me, yeah, it was a pain to try to argue with your brother when he was a kid because he was already talking like a lawyer. He went to law school later. He was already talking like a lawyer even when he was a kid. And I said, well, what about me? And she said, oh, well, you are even worse. You were the rabbi. My father had studied Talmud and so forth. And yeah, I had that logical brain, which was designed to argue about things, and especially about religion. Also, the Children of God had advised me to read the New Testament and start with the book of John. So I did. I read the book of John and only the book of John, but at that time, just the fact that I was reading the New Testament made my parents angry. And much later, I said, I was reading a lot of books at that time, and if you had not made such a big deal out of it, it would have been just another book. And she said, I know. And my father later said, they were going through a phase, just like you went through phases, so did they. Which is fair, except the term is used for children and adolescents, maybe 20-somethings, usually not to adults in their 30s or so. But there you are. I wanted to invite Alicia, the Children of God girl, to my bar mitzvah. My parents didn't like the idea. They were afraid that she would disrupt it. And actually, that might have happened. In addition, she really didn't want to go in the first place. She had no interest in going when I told her about it. Maybe I was a teeny bit crushed out on her, as was their intention. Actually, mainly I had crushes on two girls in what was called CAM Junior High, which stood for Kamehameha, which was, of course, the great warrior king who united all the governments in the Hawaiian island into one nation state. And so was, and I guess to many people still is, considered a hero, so the school was named after her. Anyways, I had these two crushes on these two girls, both like 12, 13, about my same age. One was blonde, blue-eyed, white, definitely what they called a haole, which just meant a white person. I was also a haole, but she was more haole. And at the same time, I also had a crush on a Hawaiian, like indigenous Hawaiian girl who had brown skin, brown eyes, long black hair. So my tastes were eclectic at the time. And you can see that balancing my spirituality with my carnality was problematic. Fortunately for me, well, there were very mixed messages coming from the children of God about whether Christians should be actively sexual, before marriage. Later, I learned that the answer to that question became absolutely, definitely, and in many different ways, and especially so for Moses David himself. And that made me mad because I had given up an opportunity uh, based on the idea that Christians shouldn't have premarital sex. But that was later. That was when I was all the way at 13. I was only 12 now at this point. So the bar mitzvah happened. It was a Hawaiian hippie bar mitzvah. The circle of friends definitely fit the hippie mold, although some of them were, you know, solidly upper middle class, or at least middle class hippies. My stepfather was, and Jeffrey was definitely. So I had a lay on, and their niece, no, Irene's niece, also got bat mitzvahed with me. And we wore, I guess we kind of dressed up a little bit, but not that much. And we wore flowered leis around our necks. And I think after that, people smoked weed and drank mango rum punch. I got a bit tipsy. My mom had made an agreement with me, something to do with how we were supposed to, I don't remember exactly. But after the ceremony, I also, by the way, my father had been put in charge of training me for my bar mitzvah, which he did. And even though he was no longer technically religiously Jewish, he had plenty of knowledge about it. And I wound up saying a prayer in Aramaic, which was a bit of a rebellion, a subtle rebellion, because usually they say it in Hebrew, and Aramaic was a later and more obscure Jewish language, spoken in the late Old Testament and in the New Testament era by the Jews at the time. Anywho, I got kind of tipsy. I went and talked to Irene, and I was complaining how my mom, my parents, my mother and stepfather wouldn't let me invite Elisha to the bar mitzvah. And then Irene told my mom, and my mom got angry at me and said that, she usually, what she did, she said she bragged about me to her friends about how sophisticated I was, going to all these different religions and such. But she also felt that this thing I had said to Irene had made her feel that this agreement was now null and void because I had violated the terms. The thing about making agreements with them at this point was that I began to notice that they didn't always remember what we had agreed to, and I did. I have a good memory for what people say. And that kind of created, more friction and some real distrust. More of that later. But anyhow, now I was 13 and I was bar mitzvahed. And I guess whatever I ended up saying, maybe I said it to make the relatives, the grandparents happy. That was a good enough reason. I also got some money, which she told me was not a good enough reason to get some money. But yeah. So what else? I swam in the ocean. I swam in swimming pools. Uh, and then my family moved away from Kaneohe. I still kept going to the same school. They moved to Wahiwa, which was a mostly a Filipino sugarcane cutter town. My brother had a babysitter that lived nearby. I'm not entirely sure why we made the move. I know that my stepfather was having a lot of trouble with his boss at work. Apparently, his boss had singled him out as a weirdo, which, I mean, he did have a big, like, Jufro at the time, as well as a beard. And, he later said, "Oh yeah, he got mad at me just because I like did some yoga or something." And my mom said, "Well, actually, you and another guy you were working with went on the lawn, meditated, did yoga, did tai chi, maybe chanted something, hugged each other in a gesture of brotherly love. Like it was more than just, one thing. They did a whole bunch of things that made them seem weird in the eyes of his boss, uh, and many other people, I'm sure. He was like a little ahead of the curve on new agey stuff, especially in Hawaii. Maybe still would be, I don't know. He had also gotten into a car crash. They had both gotten into a car crash, and the way he described it was there was this guy in this truck headed for him, and every time he swerved to get out of the way, this guy turned the truck so that it was still coming towards them, and finally they crashed, head-on collision. Not an accident, he said. The guy was trying to hit them. They weren't really harmed much, but it was a bit traumatic for them, he said. And sometimes he told me when he got high, he would have this fantasy that he was actually in a coma in the hospital, and everything he experienced in his life since the accident was just a dream. And I said, well, why would you only become aware of that when you got stoned, which, if you were in the hospital, you wouldn't have actually done? They might have given him drugs, but he wouldn't have been smoking a joint and suddenly realized this. And he said, well, we were also studying Tibetan Buddhism at the time, and there's a lot on things not necessarily being real. And much later, I encountered that school of thought when a Buddhist friend of mine said, well, maybe it would help if you thought of this life as being just a dream. And I said, that sounds like it would really lead me to some serious disassociation. Actually, considering your life to be not real, only a dream, or having a strong feeling of that, basically is the clinical definition of disassociation. And while I'm getting way ahead of myself, it comes from a fundamental misunderstanding. Like, the world does exist, it just doesn't really exist in the way that we perceive it to exist. Our assumptions about reality, which our culture as well as our senses tell us, are very limited, and reality on the ultimate level is different. But on the mundane level, you still have to function in the world, know your name, keep your ID card, and so forth. Also, there's a text, I believe, maybe a Tibetan text, anyway, a Mahayana text that says, this life is like a dream, like a raindrop falling, like a rainbow, like a dewdrop that starts to dissolve almost as quickly as it comes into existence. Therefore, use your time wisely. And I later said, this doesn't actually say life is a dream. It says life is like a dream. It's a simile. But I was 12, 13, not capable, didn't have the knowledge and not really the capacity to analyze things that deeply. And I guess he didn't really either, because he would just think that his life was a delusion, which I can understand. I've had that feeling at times as well, often during or after something really pretty severe has happened, like something where I felt like I could have been killed. And then I would think, but maybe I was, maybe I'm already dead. But I wasn't there yet. I was in Hawaii. I swam. I was on this. And then, oh yes, after my parents had a collection of music, varied, eclectic, but a lot of the 1960s bands, the Beatles, the Grateful Dead, the Jefferson Airplane, all that. And I picked out as my favorite the Velvet Underground, the Banana album. And my stepfather said, that is the most decadent album we have. And it was. There were songs about heroin. There were songs about BDSM, Oh, by the way, I go a little bit back before I went to Hawaii. As well as having sadistic fantasies, I clearly already had a masochistic streak as well, because I learned about Houdini in school. Yeah, in an earlier video, I didn't really learn anything at school except college. That was an exaggeration. I learned some things. For example, I learned about Harry Houdini. And then I was at some concert, I think my Wooden If in Bandiyar band that I was briefly a member of. And I told an attractive adult woman that I wanted to be like Houdini. So could she please tie my hands behind my back so that I could try to escape? And she did. And I escaped. And it wasn't until very much later that I came to understand what that was about. Although, ironically, later after that, I found having my hands tied up. Never found that to be very pleasant. Okay, we're skipping way too far ahead. We moved to Wahiwa, and my brother had Filipino babysitters that moved next door. On New Year's Eve, my parents attended the Tendai Buddhist, the Japanese Buddhist temple, again for a New Year's Eve ceremony, which I know I would have enjoyed going with. But instead, I was assigned to stay home and take care of my brother. But after a bit, we could walk to the Filipino babysitter's house, and there would be a cool Filipino Hawaiian New Year's Eve celebration. So I'm like, okay, that doesn't sound bad. But me and my brother went out walking, and somebody threw a firecracker at us, which was not atypical. And my parents called, and I was like, talked to my brother. I was like, don't tell him about the firecracker. Don't tell him about the firecracker. But he did. He told him about the firecracker. And my parents were like, you can't go to the party anymore. You have to stay home, and don't argue about it. And I was so mad. Like at 13, suddenly being told that you couldn't go do anything fun on New Year's Eve when you had been led to believe you could was just an absolute tragedy. So I made sure that even though I kept my word and stayed home, I would still manage to make it unsafe. And I did that by opening all the doors and windows and then blasting the Velvet Underground. Later, I heard that the early punk scene was composed of people who had been the only Velvet Underground fan in their town and the only Iggy and the Stooges fan at their town in their town, and that suited me because I was almost certainly the only Velvet Underground fan in many towns. And in Hawaii in 1975, definitely not on the radar. My friends liked pop songs like Shimmy Shimmy Cocoa Puff and Like a Rhinestone Cowboy and such. And that stuff drove me crazy. So anyways, midnight, midnight in Hawaii. Well, my father, who was in Honolulu at the time, he said, and he was a World War II veteran, he said he had been told that it was like a battle. And after he experienced it, he said, it actually was like a battle, except they only used the light artillery. They didn't use the heavy artillery. But, it was like a minor skirmish in a battle. That's how Hawaiians do it on New Year's Eve, probably largely due to the Asian and many different kinds of Asians there for many generations. The place pretty much exploded. And I think the noise coming from all those firecrackers distracted people from hearing the music I was playing and trying to enter the house. So in a way, it worked to my advantage. No harm came to us. So at school, I definitely was not fitting in. I had a friend about my age, maybe a bit older, and he said, well, why don't you have a girl to go with? And I'm like, what does that mean? And she said, well, you walk her to class, you carry her books, stuff like that. And I was thinking, why in the heck would I want to do that? I mean, I know I want to have sex with them, but why would I want to carry their books around? Made no sense to me. And the boys and the girls during lunch ate at separate cafeterias. So naturally, I bucked the mold and sat at the girls' cafeteria. No, and they didn't do that in California. It was new to me. I later learned that during the period of the Hawaiian monarchies, men and women did sit separately. And that went on until one of the queens, went and ate with the men. And she didn't like the system because, frankly, the men got better food. And I said that basically destroyed the kapu, meaning taboo system, which is probably true. And they said it also completely destroyed the indigenous religion. So when the Christian missionaries arrived, they found a people with no religion. And that is not really true. That queen, whose name escapes me, definitely was hostile. I mean, at the time, Hawaii was a theocracy, and this was when it was the islands of Hawaii had been united into one state for generations, and it was basically a theocracy. And she didn't like that. She tore down the material from all the temples, the organic material, the bases of which were made of all volcanic rock. Fortunately, those remain because it was too hard to tear them down, to move them. So they're still there. And so when I went to a museum in Hawaii, I mean, basically they portrayed this as the Hawaiian people in and of themselves getting rid of their primitive religion completely, and then being ready for the more enlightened religion of Christianity when the missionaries arrived. So actually, and I know I'm going on a tangent here, but that's all right, I think, the religion didn't disappear. As you might expect, it went underground, and that was really what they called kahunaism began. So kahunas, it was completely decentralized. The kahunas, there were no like main temple, there were no functioning temples. The kahunas were the highest spiritual authorities, and they kind of laid low. And if you know the history of other societies that have tried to ban religion in general, that is what tends to happen. It just goes underground and then comes back as soon as it can. And indeed, kahunaism has come back. And to go further on my little rant tangent, well, more recently I visited the big island of Hawaii and, toured some of the sites. And I realized that, okay, so this happened in the 19th century, I believe. It was really in par with what was happening in the rest of the world. The American Revolution, which didn't try to get rid of religion, but did separate church and state, ending the British style, which was a theocracy, to a certain extent still is. And then the French Revolution, not long after, did absolutely seek to ban theistic religions altogether. And of course, that didn't last very long. And then in the early 20th century, we have the Russian Revolution and then the rest of the communist stuff. So it wasn't really a matter of, primitive people realizing that their ancient beliefs were wrong and abandoning them. No, it was in par with what was going on at the time in the Western world, in Europe, in North America, and later in Asia, Caribbean, and so forth. But religion always comes back. But at the time, I told a couple of people who were of indigenous Hawaiian descent, or at least partially so, that my mother and stepfather had gone to Molokai and visited a kahuna, and they said, why are they so superstitious? But now, kahunaism and the whole polytheism that goes with it has definitely returned and is closely connected in many cases to the Hawaiian sovereignty system. Anyways, wahiwa. And my parents' next gig, my mother and stepfather had gone to, they had gotten a job on a maybe volunteer, I don't know, maybe getting food and lodging, but they were going to work as a volunteer at the Tibetan refugee camp in India, Dharamsala. And this, of course, was as a result of their Tibetan connections. So they told me that me and my brother would go with them. And by the way, before this, they were going to take a whole tour of India. And they said, well, you are going to have to bring your brother on a plane. He was a toddler. Basically, well, if I was like 13, he was 5. I remember him saying, I was trying to tell him not to run away from me when my folks were somewhere else. And he said, "I'm already 5." And I said, "I don't care." And he said, "I'm going to tell mommy. I said I'm already 5 and you said I don't care." I know he's in my audience, so he'll be amused by this. I hope. Anyways, the plan was that I would take my 5-year-old brother on a plane, change planes in Bangkok, Thailand, and then join them in India, which seemed like a good plan to me. But then they changed their mind and they didn't take me. And if they had even said, "I'm sorry, I know we said we'd take you, but we realize it's not a good idea. It's for various reasons, and we just can't do it," that might have helped. But instead, they simply forgot that they had ever said it. And later I got sent back to live with my father in the depressing, dead town of Richmond, California, or so it was at the time to me. Oh, yes. And speaking of them, like not remembering the agreement. So I had mentioned in one of the other videos, they had a system of punishing me, one of the least psychologically, it wasn't psychologically harmful at all. When it was on the level, I really didn't mind. They would pay me an allowance. They would pay me to do chores. And then if I did something wrong, they would fine me and I'd have to give a few bucks back. All right. It's kind of, it's not personal. They're not screaming at me. They're not insulting me. They're not threatening me physically. It's, so I didn't mind so much. But they took this to my grades at school. Now, I was having a lot of trouble in school, largely because of me being twice exceptional. Reading, on the one hand, reading Camus when I was 12, and on the other hand, getting a D in my Spanish class because I don't learn languages very well in a school setting, although I think I stored some away. And my mom was mad at me for getting a D. I was saved in math. I got an A. Later, they told me, how come you got an A in math when you're so bad at it? And I said, well, because the teacher taught us to solve problems in a certain way. And then another teacher came in and found that we were all getting the answers wrong, and we were all getting the same wrong answers because we were all doing them in the way that this teacher had taught us. And this was kind of close to the end of the semester. Suddenly that teacher disappeared. We had a different teacher, and I got an A, and I'm just going to assume that everybody got an A in order to cover up their boo-boo. So that saved me for a minute. Yeah. Hawaiian school system. Gotta love it. So, oh yes, the fines. My stepfather said, okay, you'll be charged X amount for an F and a little less for a D, and then nothing for a C, and then you'll be given some money for a B, and you'll be given more money for an A. That was for all my grades, and they'd even it out. But then later I said, remember what we agreed? And he said, oh no, you get nothing for a C. You get fined for a C, not as much as a D or F, but you get a fine for a C. You get nothing for a B. I don't remember exactly. The point is he changed it. And he gave me these reasons why, a C grade is not good enough to get into college. And so He has to fine me for getting C's as well. And I'm thinking that has nothing to do with the fact that we agreed on something and then you forgot what we agreed on and changed it. That really made me mad. As a small aside, I remember Irene complained. They were from New York, Jeffrey and Irene. They were New Yorkers, and Hawaii must have been quite a change of pace for them. And she said, I've noticed that since I came to Hawaii, I've stopped being able to read books. Like my brain had just moved to their speed, and I can't read books anymore. Later, I went, maybe all that marijuana had something to do with that as well. They had a superior attitude towards the Hawaiian locals, which unfortunately I picked up. Now, when I would say it out loud, I remember they said, "Oh, you're not allowed to have," my folks said, "you're not allowed to have that kind of attitude because your grades are bad. If your grades were good, you could say, act like you're superior to them, but they're not. So you're not." But nevertheless, the attitude I had towards them prevailed. I mean, they're not known to be a super intellectual culture. And a friend of mine who went there more recently said that she left because of the lack of intellectual activity. But I really don't want to be insulting Hawaiians now, and I'm afraid I already have. I'm just a dumb haole. Sorry about that. The point is, I shouldn't have had that attitude in the first place. Things would have been better if I hadn't. And yeah. So the kids in Hawaii, they would act like, they would call me out to fight. They would say, "You want beef? Yuda mahu if you don't want beef." Which they use the word mahu, basically interchangeable with how boys on the mainland would say fag. Basically, anybody who was not into fighting, which their culture was into fighting, was a mahu. Now, later I learned that originally, and it's still the case in Hawaii, the mahus were basically transgender. They were the traditional trans women. It didn't just mean you were gay, and some of them were, hooked up with, partnered with men, some with women, but they dressed like women and basically occupied the same social role as women. Man. Okay. So many things come up. Anyways, then they left Hawaii to go to India without me. And I moved into the Tenrikyo Center in Honolulu. And by the way, most of these religions, I could go to all these different religions at once pretty easily because a lot of them were located on the Pali Highway. And so they were close to each other. So I could bounce from one to another. And now I could do that even more easily because I lived on the Pali Highway. The Tenrikyo Center was one of the religious institutions that was there. I think my father was having some tension there even before I came, and probably worse after I arrived, because he said that the big so-and-so of that Tenrikyo temple really didn't want him there. But out of Japanese politeness, which has its passive-aggressive aspects, but nevertheless, they let him stay there. And then he was going to take me to a Tenrikyo pilgrimage to Japan, oh man, I'm drawing a blank. Anyways, he did actually do that. He wound up doing that, and this is a good place to end because that was the end of my trip to Hawaii. I've gone back for as long as a month at a time, maybe spent a total of a whole year there, my life, but this was about 8 months where I lived there at ages 12, 13, and this is definitely a time to end it because it's gotten over an hour. Sorry. Anyways, bye.